Alright, let's imagine something today. You're a railway in a foreign land. The government has just been nice enough to give you a large chunk of money to upgrade your roster and to look more modern for the country's pride. It's the 1960s. Those EMDs sure look shiny, don't they? You'd like to put in an order for an SD45 or 3, but what's this? Your tunnels are too small, and your track is still basically stick rail. Haven't had to upgrade it with those 260 moguls from when Benjamin Harrison was still president of the USA. Think smaller. Nope. Smaller. Smaller. No, wait. Too small. There you go. EMD's G-Series units were developed especially for export near and far, and this marks the start of a short series I'll be doing about them. We'll be starting with the smallest, the GA-8, and its sibling, the GL8. The market for small export motive power was a lot bigger than one would think. As for most railroads, a unit with 600 to 800 horsepower was very versatile, but the market also was not that big, even as steam production in the US started to dip. For engines not of a standard gauge, the only options were GE's various CAT or Cooper Bessemer powered under or at 1000 horsepower units. Alco didn't make anything small, but EMD hadn't taken a crack. They had the G12 and the G8, which were essentially scaled down GP7s to fit loading gauge requirements, and they will be talked about next time, but would be possible to go even smaller and compete with GE. What they came up with was the GA-8, an end-cam locomotive oriented for bidirectional operation that could run on as little as 3-foot gauge and featured a V8 version of EMD's bulletproof 567 power plant producing 800 horsepower. The caveat with these units was how the traction motors were set up. On nearly every diesel locomotive, the traction motors are mounted between the wheels in the truck. However, because of the small gauge and limits of the time, the GA-8 didn't do that. Instead, the locomotives were mounted on AAR-type freight trucks, with the traction motors mounted to the frame and a cardan shaft running between each traction motor and each truck, with options to power one or both wheel sets per truck. EMD did this because at the time they didn't make a traction motor small enough for 3-foot gauge. Well, GE had been doing this since the end of World War II. Not the first time EMD has been way behind on something. Now to me, this is a bonkers design choice. It may be to you as well, viewer, but it wasn't bonkers enough to keep the buyers away, as EMD sold nearly 100 of them. Not a striking number by any means, but more than the GP28. The majority of GA-8 operators were in the Americas, with a handful going to South Korea, Taiwan, and Zambia. The largest number of 16 each went to Mexico and El Salvador. NDM in Mexico was starting to wind down its narrow gauge by the 60s, and the 800 horsepower diesels proved a quick way to replace up to 50-year-old steam and start to wind down branch lines. The last would continue to run into the 90s, with a roster of 4 GA-8s holding down service to the end. Several others on NDM and other South American examples would be built or re-gauged to standard gauge, as it was just as easy as replacing the trucks. 3 of El Salvador's actually ended up in Mexico as well, as the much smaller Coahuila y Zacatecas decided to replace their steam, and these units would run out the end of the narrow gauge system. El Salvador's 16 proper were bought by the International Railways of Central America for the El Salvador division, but when the railway was nationalized, they did similar to NDM's in taking over the steam on the Ferrocarriles El Salvador, who was still running Lincoln Pin Couplers 2, which had been merged into the IRCA in the nationalization. Going up in size a bit, we get to the GL8. These units were much more normal in the truck and traction motor department, although Taiwan and East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, did roster some A1A versions, and Queensland Railways had their own CC versions built under license by Clyde Engineering. These units were used on Queensland Rail's Westlander service, occasionally nicknamed the Flying Flea. The nickname for this train also sums up the GA-8 and the GL8 quite well. The majority of the units were 4-axle, resting on EMD's export version of the Flexicoil truck, which featured a truck-mounted sandbox. Horsepower on all GL8s was raised to 875 horsepower, and while they were still light units, they were keyed toward more mixed traffic and faster moving assignments than their smaller siblings. The best example of this being the 15 that went to Ireland, becoming the 121 class and signaling the beginning of the Lagrange products taking over the Irish broad gauge, CIE getting tired of the unreliability of British-built designs. Although of all classes of export diesel, these units are definitely high up on the scatterblast list, with units shipped to, as before mentioned, Ireland, Brazil, East Pakistan, Taiwan, and Tunisia, with the Australian-built additions adding to the weirdness. What is probably not a surprise is both types of unit are still running in some capacity around the world, as they've settled into the modern railroad world as light switchers for working at locomotive shops or continuing to ply lines with lighter laid rail. A fair number have also been preserved in at least Mexico, Taiwan, and El Salvador. These little G-series units are definitely unique, the GA-8 especially as a unit that tried to take on GE's various small narrow-gauge creatures and even despite its weirdness found a small niche for itself, though showing EMD was a bit better with larger gauges. The G-series units that were even more successful? Well, that's next time. Thank you for watching. I decided to break up the theme with another small dive, and one that will be an ongoing series for the next 2 months or so. How far into the Gs will go depends on the popularity. If you want to see an eventual video on the GT26 series units, like and subscribe.